And welcome to tonight's edition of the One Hood Power Hour. I am your co-host, Kahari Mosley, here with my co-hosts, Miracle Jones and Ryan White. And we have another incredible conversation this evening. We are going to do part 2 of our spring primary election preview. We have Aerion Abney from All Politics is Local and Chris Potter coming back and joining us from WESA FM. So when they come on, we're going to be talking all about the local elections as well as things voters need to know, important information for voters and important issues that are going to be under consideration as voters either mail in their ballots or get out to the polls on May 18th. But before we get into that, we have a number, of things going on nationally as well as statewide. Obviously, the COVID-19 relief bill passed in the Senate, and it went back to the House for some minor tweaks. And it looks like at some point in the near future, the COVID-19 relief bill will pass. Was there anything, we'll start with Miracle and go to Ryan. Was there anything, in that particular relief bill that stands out other than obviously the $1.9 trillion price tag that many people are talking about?
I think that for a lot of folks, there was a lot of disappointment about what was not in the bill, such as the $2,000 direct payments. But I know a lot of people are happy, such a lot of families, because there is a tax credit per child. So for the first time, a lot of families are going to get additional support. In addition, the people who are eligible were expanded. So individuals who are also dependents are now getting support as well. Of course, there's a big debate about the reopening of schools. We have seen that for about 6 months now. There's even, protests, people burning masks. And so there was some money to help people who will help support the reopening of schools, providing teachers with PPE, as well as a request for teachers to be eligible to get the vaccine to make them essential workers. So there's a lot of things that are happening. Of course, for a lot of folks, the bill could have done a lot more, but for what it's doing for impacted families, it did expand some folks, so more people are going to be able to get support this time around. Unfortunately, student loans were not able to be folded into this bill, but also what's really, really cool for a lot of nonprofit arts organizations, there was also a lot of funding for the arts because, as we've seen the past year, we're coming up on a year anniversary. I don't know if that's what we call it, the anniversary of COVID, but we're coming up on this year, and we've seen how important the arts is just to keeping people engaged, entertained, providing people's maintenance for mental health support, and so much more. And so it was great to see the arts as well get a little bit of funding, even though there could have been a lot more, but there's some of the benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, that sums up a lot of it pretty well. I'm definitely really glad that, some version of the originally proposed relief bill went through, because briefly it looked like, nothing might not even get through the Senate. I believe it was record time as far as the length of deliberation and negotiation that was needed to get it through. Obviously some disappointments, with the reduced amount of the stimulus check, with Senator Manchin and others, pushing back on certain things that wasn't really anticipated, apparently, such as, income caps on certain eligibilities for certain benefits. But, it's still really good to see, some version of this bill get passed, especially assuming it passes in the House as well, get passed in time for some of the things like the extension of unemployment benefits, because some of that was set to expire coming up soon. So it's good to see at least some version of this get passed, especially after certain other things in the Senate couldn't get through, such as the minimum wage increase, and other things like that have been going on around in the country. So, it's kind of par for the course for Biden's presidency so far. Like, it doesn't live up to the full extent of his promise for sure, but it's still going to help out a lot of people that really need that right now. So, at least for their sake, I'm happy it was able to get through.
Absolutely. And one of the interesting things that I saw this morning on MSNBC Morning Joe, Steve Ratner, I believe that's his name, a former Commerce or Treasury official in the Obama administration, actually said that, based on projections, the $1.9 trillion bill will bring poverty down from 12% to 8%. That's more than almost any other piece of policy, in history. That's primarily due to the child tax credits and the elements to address childhood poverty. Miracle, was there something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think that for a country that is very much predicated on this idea of family values and the family unit, the fact that this is one of the first times in like recent modern history we're actually investing in families is very telling. But additionally, along with that is this conversation of the universal basic income, which Pittsburgh is one of the pilot cities, and they're going to be launching that in the next few weeks, which is my understanding. The idea that we're able to reduce child poverty by 4%, which is a substantial margin, just through these temporary measures, really shows how much more the elected officials need to be doing to address these disparities within the communities. Yes, universal pre-K, yes, helping teachers safely go back to work, opening up the schools is really great. But we're now actually seeing that these direct cash payments are going to have substantial immediate impacts on the well-being of families across the country. So hopefully this will be more of a trend that as people get back on their feet, the government will invest in more local domestic issues. Because at the same time, all this is going on, there were, there was the bombing at the Syrian border that a lot of people were very taken aback by and thrown off by, because that was not an ongoing conversation at the time that people thought that was going to be a reality so quickly. And so we're also seeing with the collapse of our infrastructure, there are a lot of domestic issues that deserve attention and investment. So hopefully this will be the start of a different trajectory for the country.
Absolutely. And in statewide news, a gentleman named Jeff Bartos, who was a candidate for lieutenant governor with Scott Wagner, announced his candidacy as a Republican candidate for the United States Senate. And he's really been touting the work that he's done, helping provide loans to businesses during the pandemic. Put out a video, earlier today. So another candidate throws their hat into the ring for what is going to be a very popular a U.S. Senate seat as the months go by. A week or so after, we mentioned Malcolm Kenyatta's candidacy, and obviously John Fetterman, the lieutenant governor, some weeks prior. So that was the first kind of major Republican name that's come out, and I imagine there will be more, in the wake of, I believe it was a rebuke that the Pennsylvania Republican Party gave current Senator Pat Toomey for his vote to convict during the Senate impeachment trial.
Yeah, that's elections in 2022. Like we have barely escaped 2020. We're just starting the election in 2021, and we already have a super competitive race for 2022. Well, we're actually seeing a lot of good candidates. So out of that, it's going to be a crop of great ideas that we're going to be able to talk about the future of Pennsylvania and some of the investment. We know cannabis legalization is going to be a really big issue. We know and the schools reopening is going to be a very big issue. We know the power of what a governor can and cannot do is going to be a huge issue. And so to have all these people announcing more than a year and a half out is going to make the field highly competitive. And again, the amount of money these campaigns are garnering and are going to be forced to raise is going to bring possibly a lot of jobs and a lot of traffic to Pennsylvania. So I think that may be helpful in the long run.
Absolutely. Ron, you have any thoughts on the newest hat that's got thrown into the U.S. Senate ring for the state of Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I did hear that happened earlier today. I haven't, looked into it too heavily yet. But, just to echo what y'all have been saying, it's definitely going to be a super, super contentious election. I think it's really going to continue that trend, of Pennsylvania being really at the center of, from a national perspective, at the center, where a lot of the emphasis is on elections, as far as funding, as far as advocacy from other candidates and other interested groups and things like that, and really just how hotly contested statewide Pennsylvania elections are going to be going forward in the future. And obviously the Senate elections won't be impacted by this, but also especially considering Pennsylvania is looking like we're gonna be losing a district as well. So those other congressional elections will be even more contentious as well.
Right. And that could push some congressional candidates to run for Senate.
Yep, absolutely. So
thinking like, hey, I'm going to have to lose my seat or, run in a competitive primary against another member of Congress. I might be better off going statewide.
Exactly. Yeah. So just like both of y'all said, really, it's hard to even think that far ahead when we're, right in the middle of the 2021 primaries right now. But it's, definitely going to be interesting.
Yeah, and I know for future shows we'll be talking about it, but there's also the whole redistricting. We've lost population, so we're losing a district, but also we're redrawing districts as well. So what does that fight look like? That's going to be another huge legislative judicial fight that's coming down. And of course we'll cover that in a future show. But also, this week is the first day of the Derek Chauvin trial. He's going on trial for the murder of George Floyd, and we've already seen a lot of cities are preparing for social distress already, and it's kind of unfortunate that cities are preparing for a not guilty verdict already. And so what we're hoping to see is a better response from elected officials, from people running for office at this time, because we know it's going to be very heightened. Yes, the Harry and Meg interview kind of forced people to talk about race relations this past cycle, but also this trial is going to push that more into public discourse, I believe, than it's really has actually been over this past year. And so that's also something that we have to pay attention to as we look at this upcoming election.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted to mention one more thing before we segue into our first guest, which I think is very relevant based on what Mr. Abney is going to cover this evening. And the fact that it's been recently reported that in 43 states, over 500 pieces of legislation are under consideration that would limit voting rights in some manner or form. And many people are really beginning to sound the alarm. Arizona, Pennsylvania are two states that are really being closely watched for a lot of activity. Now many of these bills obviously won't pass, but some of them will, in various states, and it's just very, very interesting. We talked about this. I think we talked about this with Lieutenant Governor Fetterman, using the big lie as a pretext to pass legislation to fix irregularities and problems, with the electoral system that have not shown to have exist at the current time, and clearly weren't in existence during the 2020 election.
Yeah, and I know Georgia has been very successful in these in Georgia, and for people who are not aware, Georgia and North Carolina basically are the test states when it comes to voter suppression laws. They first get tested in North Carolina and Georgia, and then the rest of the conservative-run states follow suit. If you've been following the voter suppression law since a portion of the Voting Rights Act was overturned by the Supreme Court. They ended no excuse absentee voting in Georgia. That bill has yet to be signed by the governor. But of course, there is the I believe it's like Fair Justice or Fair Vote Act that is pending in the U.S. Congress, which would restore the Voting Rights Act and would make all of these new voter suppression bills null and void. And so we're still waiting to see what that looks like. And of course, that does, depend on the ending of the filibuster and different issues on the national level. So it's going to be a good thing that these candidates are going to have to stump on, like in this upcoming election. Are we changing the Supreme Court? Are we going to have to pack the court to get voting rights protected? So it's going to be, I think that people are already exhausted from the last election, but I don't think people realize how much more intense it's going to be over the next 6 months to a year.
Absolutely, Ron. Any thoughts on this recent revelation of this? In over 40 states, over 500 pieces of legislation focused on limiting voting rights and restricting access to the polls.
Yeah, I mean that's a figure I hadn't heard before. You just mentioned that. I can't say it's particularly surprising, but it definitely speaks to just the sheer urgency and importance of these off-year elections, of a lot of these other bills and issues that people don't tend to think about as much in these off years, when it's not a huge presidential election, when something to that national scale isn't going on. So yeah, it really just speaks to the urgency of continuing to organize, continuing to keep up that pressure and intensity and advocacy and civic engagement to really, build momentum around those issues and protecting and bolstering those voting rights as well. Not even just preventing more legislation from being passed to suppress voting rights, but continuing to work towards undoing a lot of the voter suppression that we still have in place right now. Through things such as Miracle mentioned, that act that would fully restore the Voting Rights Act as well.
Absolutely, and for those who weren't with us last week, Ron's referring to For the People Act that was passed in Congress this past week and is now in the U.S. Senate. And so now it was a perfect segue, just what we were just talking about, for our next guest, Aerion Abney from All Politics is Local, who has spent a lot of time the last several years really focusing on ensuring that people have the right to vote, election protection, protecting people's voting rights at the polls, as well as registering voters and increasing the level of civic participation. So we're really excited to talk about important voting rights issues with Aerion Abney from All Politics Local. So welcome to the show this evening.
Hey, it's going well. Good evening. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. Being able to be here on this show with you all, and thank you for creating this platform to share out really great information. I know it's only been 15, 20 minutes so far, and you've already shared out a plethora of information on multiple topics. So thank you for doing this, and thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Miracle, do you want to start with the first question?
Yes. So, like I said, we're starting, tomorrow, like ballots, petition signatures supposed to be turned in for these candidates. But for a lot of folks, there's still a lot of questions about what this upcoming election looks like. So can you just walk through some important dates that people need to mark on their calendars regarding this upcoming election?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first I'll say there is, coming off of the general election last fall in 2020, there was obviously a lot of enthusiasm, high voter turnout all over the place. And, we're trying to do everything that we can as voting rights groups to try to keep that momentum and that energy going into this upcoming election, because it's really important. Most people, we try to emphasize to folks that there aren't just elections every 4 years, but there's elections every year, right? There's primaries and there's generals every year. And so, as Kahari mentioned on the onset of the show, the next upcoming election, primary election, is May 18th. That is Tuesday, May 18th, is election day to go to the polls. Polls will be open like they typically are from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. On election day. But of course, in order to actually cast your ballot in this upcoming election, you have to first be registered to vote. And in order to register to vote, there's multiple ways you can do it. You can do it through a paper form. You can do it online at votespa.com. But the deadline to actually register to vote before the May 18th election is going to be Tuesday. It's going to be May the 3rd. So May the 3rd is the last day to register to vote. And then if anybody is looking to cast their ballot early or to vote by mail, there is a deadline in which you have to apply for a vote by mail ballot. And that deadline is Tuesday, May the 11th. So 1 week before the election is the last day which you can request a vote by mail ballot. And then that ballot has to be completed and back into the elections office by election day on May 18th. So one of the things that we always try to encourage folks is, because there are deadlines, don't wait until the last minute to do any of those things. You don't want to wait until the last minute to register to vote, because there's a process on the back end that counties have to actually run your paperwork and make sure it gets approved, and then mail you out your card and then add you to the list. You don't want to wait until 1 week before the election to submit your vote by mail application form, because the county has to get it, process it, and mail you out your actual ballot. And we know 7 days is not really a lot of time for people to get something back in the mail, fill it out, and send it back to the county. So the sooner the better. You can register to vote right now. You don't have to wait. You can fill out your vote by mail application form right now. You don't have to wait until 1 week before the election.
Now, I had a quick question. Now, last fall, there was a program by the county where they had what was called in-person absentee voting. Now, are there any plans on doing something similar around this primary election?
So that's a great question. So in 2019, the legislature passed Act 77, which allowed for vote by mail, no excuse vote by mail, as well as being able to have this form of early voting at these satellite election offices. And so they really implemented it very heavily in Allegheny County in the last general election. There's a lot of questions about what this is going to look like for the primary, a lot of unanswered questions right now. So organizations like One Hood and our organization, All Voting is Local, and others are actually reaching out to Allegheny County elections officials right now to get some of those questions answered, because one of the concerns is that people have developed these expectations of how they can go and vote based off of the last election. And the last thing that we want to do is be regressive when it comes to access to the ballot. And this upcoming election, if we show that there's no voting by mail, there's no satellite offices, there's no drop boxes, it makes it easier for those folks who don't really want that stuff to justify not having it, right? And so we are trying to push the Allegheny County elections officials to have drop boxes and to have satellite elections offices, because you mentioned earlier, 2022 is going to be a major election year. A lot of people are running for, U.S. Senate and other offices, but the decisions about how that is made happens in 2021. This is a very critical year for election administration and policies. And if we don't have counties implementing some of the benefits of Act 77, like satellite offices and early voting and drop boxes, then we could see them be completely eliminated potentially in 2022, which is going to essentially limit people's access to the ballot.
Ryan, did you have a question for Aerion?
Yeah, I did actually. Thanks, Kahari. So I saw a report earlier. I think I saw it in Public Source earlier today. That was talking about how in the November election, there were some complications as far as some of the poll workers not being able to be trained because of concerns over COVID, and just not having enough staffing and things like that. So, given that we've now dealt with a couple elections in the pandemic era already, do you anticipate things flowing a lot more smoothly and having, a lot more of those resources and staffing be able to be, set up and organized ahead of time? Or do you think there will still be, some complications on that end of things, just as the nature of the pandemic and, everything that comes with that?
Well, I think pandemic aside, you can ask anybody that's been involved in elections, either on the advocacy side or the election administration side or the campaign side. There is no elections that run completely flawless. There's always going to be some things that are that kind of come up that you have to deal with and you have to sort of be responsive to. But you can be proactive in terms of planning, right? You can learn from past elections where you may have things like poll workers not showing up on time to open the polling location, right? Or you'll have voting machines that, malfunction and, it takes them, longer than it should take them to come in and actually repair that thing. So we try to push the county elections officials all across the Commonwealth to be proactive and having a continuity of operations plan, which essentially says, here's our plan if A, B, or C happens, or A, B, and C goes wrong. We have a plan in action. We have protocol. We know who's responsible for what, and we have a plan to get it resolved in a quick fashion. Now, when it comes to poll workers are volunteers. They do get paid about $100 or so, depending on what county that you're in, but they are volunteers, and they are our frontlines election administrators. They are the ones that really determine who is able to cast that ballot and who isn't able to cast that ballot. So training is critical to ensure that those folks know what the laws are. They're updated on that. They know what the policies are, and they do everything in their power to ensure that somebody who wants to be able to cast a ballot has the opportunity to cast that ballot. Those job positions are very critical, and I encourage folks who may be interested in getting more involved in sort of the process to call your county board of elections office and sign up and get more information on how to become a poll worker. Like I said, there is training and you do get paid to do that. So we encourage folks to take advantage of that opportunity.
Yeah, and people just have to be 18 to be a poll worker, correct?
Yes. So they're supposed to be, by law, technically, they're supposed to be registered to vote in the county in which they are looking to be a poll worker. So yeah, you have to be 18. You could be 17, getting ready to turn 18, because you can be registered to vote being 17, getting ready to turn 18. So yes.
And are there any particular things that voters should need to know about, the primary election and how it's different from a general election? Any particular rules for, who can and who can't participate, in certain aspects of primary elections?
Yeah, so in Pennsylvania, every state's a little bit different. So we don't necessarily have a completely open primary process, which means that generally speaking, in most elections, folks who are not part of a specific political affiliation, Democrat or Republican, are not typically able to vote in the primary. They can only vote in a general election. However, there is an exception for cases when there are ballot measures, right? So in this upcoming primary, there are going to be several ballot measures depending on what county that you're in the Commonwealth. I know that there are some ballot measures for the primary that's around restricting the governor's sort of powers in sort of emergency situations. And then in Allegheny County, I believe Alliance for Police Accountability was working on a petition to get Breonna's law for ending no-knock warrants onto the upcoming ballot question, and then also ending solitary confinement. So those folks who are independent, they're not going to be able to vote for mayor or for city council, but they can vote on the ballot initiatives.
And thank you for that. And for anyone who's looking to, find any more specific information about the election, what the races are, who's running, information about the candidates, how they can apply to vote by mail and just different resources like that. Is there any specific, resources, websites, places to find information that you'd like to highlight for people to go to?
Yeah, I think the best place online to go to would be votespa.com. That is the official Pennsylvania Department of State website. The Department of State is technically responsible for how elections are run in the Commonwealth. On that website, you can find out how to register to vote. You can find out how to apply for your vote by mail ballot application. You can find out where your polling location is. You can find out if you do apply for a vote by mail ballot, you can track the status of your ballot to find out where it is. And then also on the Votes PA website, you can also find information on your specific County Board of Elections office. So if you have any more specific questions about, say, for example, is your county going to do drop boxes and where are those drop boxes going to be, or where are those early voting sites going to be, you can call your County Board of Elections to get that information. But I know there's organizations, obviously, like One Hood and our organization, All Voting is Local. You can go to allvotingislocal.org to get more information about some of the work that we're doing. And as we get information about how the county plans to roll out their election operations for this upcoming primary, I would love to be able to possibly close to the election, come back on the show and talk about, hey, here are the satellite election offices, here are the drop boxes, and here are the locations, here are the times that they're opening. That's just some continued advocacy that we're working on to get those answers for you all.
And of course, before we wrap up, can you explain to the folks what a provisional ballot is? Because that's one of the issues that we had in the general election is people requested to vote by mail, got ballots, either didn't use their ballot, lost their ballot, something happened, and they had to vote provisionally, and people didn't understand that process. So can you just walk people through what that is and why it's so important to track their voter registration and to track whether or not they've received a ballot?
Yeah, so provisional ballot is essentially like a backup ballot that are stashed at the polling location in each specific precinct. The poll workers have access to a provisional ballot, and they can give a voter a provisional ballot for a multitude of different reasons. But what typically happens is a voter may show up and their polling location change, and they show up maybe at the wrong location. And so the poll worker may look in their book to verify who you are. And if they don't see your name in that book, they're not going to issue you a traditional ballot. They're going to give you a paper provisional ballot, which the candidates on that ballot are exactly the same as any other ballot for that election cycle. The difference is those provisional ballots at that polling location are put to the side, and they are put in a different bucket when they're sent back to the County Board of Elections to be counted. And the County Board of Elections then has to just go through that those provisional ballots, see who voted it, and verify if you were at the right location or not. And it depends on what's on the ballot, right? So if you showed up at the wrong location in 2020 and you were voting for someone like city council and you were in the wrong district, what they would do is they wouldn't count the vote for city council because it wasn't your city council district, but they would count your vote for US president because you technically, no matter where you were in that area, you could vote for president. And so that's one of the reasons why we are, like you said, strongly encouraging folks, if they do plan to vote by mail, to use votespa.com to track their ballot, to make sure that they have it. And if they aren't getting it, 3 weeks before the election, to call the County Board of Elections to remind them, hey, I applied and I haven't received it. And one of the last things that I'll just say about the benefits of voting by mail, which we're really strongly encouraging folks to do, we've got data that from the last previous elections across the country, that there's a higher use of provisional ballots amongst Black and brown folks, which means that, going back to your question earlier, Ryan, about poll worker training, sometimes poll workers aren't always properly trained to do the proper research to find out if the person in front of them can vote at that place. And so one of the things they naturally go to is, hey, I can't find you in the poll book, I'm just going to give you a provisional ballot. And it is really disconcerting to see that more Black and brown folks are treated this way. And so one of the things that we're trying to encourage folks to do is to vote by mail, because you're verified ahead of time and that ballot comes to you. You can vote in the safety of your own home. And it gives you, voting by mail gives you the opportunity to do a little bit more research on the candidates, right? Because you can look at who you're voting for, you can look them up, versus I know sometimes I've gone into the booth and I didn't know everybody was on the ballot. The first time I saw their name was on election day in the booth, and I didn't really have enough time to figure out if those person represented my ideals. And so voting by mail helps to alleviate the provisional ballot issue, and it helps to give voters enough time to do research on voting for the folks that they feel really what represent their interests.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Aerion Abney from All Voting is Local, and has been giving us a whole range of important information about voting rights and things that voters should be in tune to as they prepare to participate in the May 18th primary. So thank you for joining us. We definitely look forward to having you back soon.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Good evening.
And again, that's Aerion Abney from All Voting is Local, who joined us tonight, sharing again just a whole treasure trove of important information for voters who will be participating, or voters who are considering participating in the May 18th. And hopefully you heard some information that'll help you move you along in the decision to make sure you're getting your voice heard. Yeah, so now as we go to, kind of, civic information and voting information, we go, to the side of the political conversation that, that talks about the candidates and the inside baseball, and the sausage making and all the stuff that the folks who really enjoy hardcore politics love to talk about. And our next guest is someone well suited, for that conversation, and that's Chris Potter from WESA FM, who covers politics and has been covering local politics for many, many years. So, Chris, welcome to the show.
It's good to be with you, all of you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, just to jump right into it, talking about the most recent events, you were, on the front lines yesterday, as described in your Twitter feed, you said, my favorite line was, I think you said something like, if I die, tell the world my story.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, I'm still here.
Due to the mass gathering, for those who are unaware, who don't follow, if you're not one of the millions who follow Chris Potter's Twitter feed, he was making a reference to the mass gathering of voters who came to vote in the Allegheny County Democratic Committee. So let's just start with that. Tell us, all about it and what were the big takeaways.
So for those who don't spend their lives doing this stuff, the Allegheny County Democratic Committee is basically made up of a couple of thousand committee people. And there's a pair of these that represent every voting ward and district all across the county. And what they do is at about this time every year, they get together and decide amongst the candidates who are seeking to be the nominee in the primary, which ones they think Democratic voters should support. It's the endorsement of the Democratic Committee. Voters are under no obligation to pay any attention to this whatsoever. And many voters do not, and they're probably the wiser and anyway happier for it. But it is, at least in some circles, considered to be kind of a stamp of approval by party leaders. And the real advantage now is that the slate cards that you may get mailed to you or get handed out to you by a poll worker on election day will include the names of all the people who have been endorsed by the party. So yesterday was that endorsement gathering. I will say everyone was masked. Darlene Harris's mask kind of slipped underneath her nose. She wasn't alone, but so it wasn't like 100% compliance, but I felt more comfortable there than I would say at a Trump rally. And what they did is they gather at the Steam Fitters Local 449 on Sawmill Run Boulevard, and they basically vote and then count up the votes to see who's the endorsed candidate. This year, a lot of those ballots were cast by mail too. They did the same kind of thing that everybody is used to from last year, just voting in the primary and the general. The big story, of course, is that Ed Gainey, the state representative from sort of Homewood and the areas surrounding it, who's challenging Mayor Bill Peduto for the nomination, won the party's endorsement, the committee's endorsement. The mayor did not seek the endorsement. He probably wouldn't have won it if he had, and I'm sure that's part of his calculation there. and he's kind of had a rocky relationship with the committee for a lot of years. There was one other person competing for the endorsement, a guy named Tony Moreno, who is a retired city of Pittsburgh police officer. And they basically split 60-40 with Mr. Gainey winning the majority of those. Nobody's surprised by this. Ed Gainey is, in a lot of people's minds, he has a lot of support from progressive activists, a lot of people who think Bill Peduto isn't sort of far enough to the left, hasn't done enough about affordable housing, hasn't done enough to address problems with police misconduct and bias in policing. So he's got that going for him, does Ed Gainey. But on the other hand, he's also somebody who's been a longtime member of the committee himself. So he had a lot of support going into this. And I think that was reflected in the results. If there's a controversy here, I think it's that Tony Moreno did as well as he did. This is a first-time candidate. He's never run for dog catcher before. Perhaps even more controversially, he had a history on social media from a few years ago of tweeting out pro-Trump statements, retweeting some kind of shady figures on the right. He also spent about a year and a half before running, before launching his bid for mayor, as a Republican. He'd been a Democrat for 20 years here in Allegheny County, and then switched party affiliation back in 2018. So when you looked at the guy on paper, he seems a lot like a lot of the kind of old school Western Pennsylvania Democrat that we have around here, who in 2016, they heard the siren song of Donald Trump, and a lot of them switched party affiliations. And, here you've got a guy who all of a sudden decides to switch from Democrat to Republican. And all of a sudden he's, tweeting out things about Donald Trump and stick it to those liberals kind of thing. And then he switches back just a few weeks before he launches his campaign for mayor. So I think there are a lot of people who are just like, what the hell is going on in this committee that this guy got 40% of the votes? And it follows on, and we've talked about this on the program before, I think it follows on controversy from last year when this very same committee snubbed Summer Lee, very progressive, very strong voice for those values, who state rep now. The party went against her, even though she was the incumbent, which it hardly ever does. Also blew by Jessica Benham, a progressive candidate running for Harry Reid Shaw's seat, and went with endorsed a woman named Heather Cass, who also had a social media history on Facebook, not Twitter. Got to keep those straight, I guess. Also sort of praising Donald Trump and speaking pretty caustically about people who were suffering from opioid addiction. So I think there are a lot of questions, even now, even despite, 60-40 is a pretty big gap. But I think a lot of people, look at this race and say, how could it be anything less than 80-20 or 90-10? Right. And I think there's still going to be a lot of concerns about that. I can tell you that the chairwoman of the committee, Eileen Kelly, sorry, I'm getting my Eileen's confused. Eileen Kelly looked relieved at the outcome. I think she was really concerned that if Tony Moreno had won that would have been the controversy from last year all over again. She doesn't, right. Whatever personal political beliefs are, I think Eileen just doesn't really want that kind of headache. Right. But I still think there are going to be questions about this going forward, because this is an ongoing issue. The committee, even as the Democratic Party as a whole becomes younger, more diverse, more progressive in terms of its political outlook, the committee itself, at least in Allegheny County, if anything, seems to be trending somewhat in the other direction. And this is a thing that's going to continue to be an issue, I think, at least until next year, when Democrats will elect new committee members. And it will be very interesting to see whether progressives find a slate of people to go and support to change the way the party does business and the kinds of candidates and ideals that it supports.
Yeah, that's a great point. And before we go to Miracle, I feel like, for the last, 20 some years that, I've been involved in politics, I feel like every 4 years it comes around and there's quote unquote going to be some mass effort to remake the committee, but it never really seems to materialize outside of maybe certain regional committees or certain parts of the county or certain parts of the city that can kind of mount an effort, but it never wholesale kind of, you see the overhaul, of the committee. And I think you said it, I think it shows in, the folks that are in leadership, which is not a thing that's disparaging, but just the folks that are in leadership at the county and city level are two people who have been involved with the committee for decades.
Yes, that's right. And I think too, you're quite right that I have also seen efforts to reform the committee with a big slate. And look, being on the committees, running for committee is a pain in the ass. Being on the committee is even bigger pain in the ass in some ways. You know, you're dealing with just a whole lot of people and a whole lot of kind of party stuff that most sane human beings don't want anything to do with. I think that what will be interesting to me about how all this plays out this year is, I mean, there were three things that could have happened that would have been terrible for the Democratic committee, for Eileen Kelly, and for the endorsement, and for the whole process. One was if Tony Moreno had won. Two was if there were serious improprieties or allegations of improprieties about how this went down. There weren't any of those. There was a controversy involving about 20 ballots where the voter hadn't signed the outside envelope. Ms. Kelly made the decision to allow those votes to go in. That may or may not be controversial. None of the big top line races were decided by anything close to 20 votes, so it won't be a problem for those. But the third thing is there are 9 judicial seats available on the Common Pleas Court bench. The party chose its 9 on Sunday, but there are a bunch of other judicial candidates who said, to hell with this. It costs a lot of money to be even considered by the committee. We're not sure that it really does us any good. What's the value of a slate card? And what they are doing, and what we've seen with Summer Lee creating the Unite PAC, and what we're seeing with this kind of slate of judicial candidates now kind of running on its own, is alternate power structures, alternate political infrastructure. That's, yeah, you're putting the candidates on the Democratic ballot, but you're sort of doing it separate from the committee itself. And it will be very interesting to see, because I think this would be the third thing that could really spell the end of the Democratic committees, anything that even I pay attention to, and I'm hardcore on this stuff, is if the people who didn't seek that endorsement do as well or better than the people who got the endorsement. Because at that point, I mean, it's all about money. And at that point, candidates are going to go, I paid $8,000 just to be considered for this endorsement, and I didn't really, on a percentage basis, do any better than Elisa Middleman, you know, or a Mick Pappas, or any of the other folks who are, or Nicola Henry Taylor, any of the more progressive candidates who've decided to just blow this thing off. And I think at that point, you really get into what's going to decide this may or may not be the ideals. It may just be the cold, hard political realities, because the committee depends on candidates paying those thousands of dollars, because that's where it gets most of its money from these days. So if a lot of candidates say, to hell with it, I don't need it, it doesn't benefit me, then all of a sudden you're starving the beast. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens to that committee and the party going forward if that takes place.
Absolutely. Miracle?
Yeah, we've seen, I think also the people are weighing the benefits of endorsements. Because we saw the FOP endorsements come out, and a lot of people were kind of taken aback by the slate and wondering like what the process was like. So are there any more endorsements that you expect to come in the next 24 hours that people should be like on the lookout for? You know, the deadline is, you know, tomorrow for the signatures. Is basically make or break at this point. Mm-hmm. But is there any more endorsements that we need to be on the lookout? We know that I forgot the state senator just, you know, endorsed Peduto earlier today. Yeah. So it's a lot of stuff is happening. But for our judicial candidates and our school board candidates, the next 24 hours is kind of make or break.
Yeah, certainly if you're going to be on the ballot. And I think, I don't want to blow up anybody's spot here, but I think at least one of the candidates who won a Democratic endorsement on Sunday will not be actually running, will not turn in ballots, will not turn in petitions rather tomorrow. Wow. So, and that's because they require you to express an interest so early in the cycle. A lot of candidates haven't even sort of made up their mind yet. But to answer your question, Miracle, I mean, the sort of traditional big ones are the Allegheny County, the Labor Council, which is sort of an umbrella group for unions here. They've weighed in. They weighed in on Friday or Saturday. The Democratic committee has a lot of individual politicians have come in. For the most part, most of them in the mayor's race have gotten behind Bill Peduto, which is not surprising. He's the incumbent. It's kind of hard to defeat an incumbent, even if you wish he wouldn't win. It's probably the smart play to get behind him, and I think he does have, you know, a lot of support from people. I believe the Unite PAC still hasn't come down with their slate, with their picks, and I think that'll be interesting. Although, you know, I don't expect like a tremendous lot of surprises there, right? There will be some individual politicians who kind of come in. I think the bigger question for me sort of is, how much of this stuff really, what does it matter in a way? I mean, no offense to like State Senator Wayne Fontana, but who gives a damn, right? I mean, like, who cares who Senator Wayne Fontana is going to support? Some people do, but a lot don't. And I think it really sort of varies across the board. And there are certain endorsements count for more than others. I think one of the key endorsements that we've seen an interesting split on, and I've written about this, is SEIU, Service Employees International Union. There's actually kind of two branches of SEIU here in the area. One is a healthcare that represents workers who've been trying to organize at UPMC, and the other is 32BJ, which is like janitors, building guards, folks like that who do a lot of that kind of work. The building workers got behind Peduto, and the healthcare people have got behind Allegheny. And there are reasons for that, and they really speak to, I think, two very different visions of how this mayor has performed to date. If you talk to the folks at healthcare, they'll say, yeah, you know what, he really hasn't. He came into office pledging that he's going to bring UPMC to heel, that he was going to get, some sort of financial support from UPMC to city operations, because as a tax exempt nonprofit, they don't really contribute to the city the way any other business or any resident does. He was going to help us organize. He was going to push for all these things. He was going to force them to take Highmark's insurance. And if you kind of look at his record, yeah, UPMC is taking Highmark insurance now, but that's because of the state attorney general and his legal, him taking those folks to court. It doesn't have much to do with anything the mayor did. I think a lot of people would say, if you look at this mayor's record over 2 terms, he really has not delivered on that. And I think that's like kind of one of the Achilles heels that he's really got, is that issue just sort of, people don't necessarily talk about it as much as they used to, but it's still there. And Ed Gainey has talked a lot about it in recent days since he's gotten that endorsement. So I think it really depends. The value of these endorsements just depends a lot on who they represent. If you're the mayor of Pittsburgh and the FOP doesn't endorse you, there's all kinds of reasons why you shouldn't care. A lot of cops no longer live in the city. A lot of cops are registered Republicans. By the time they're even voting on you, the race is decided, because it's decided in the Democratic primary. So there's a lot of those kind of calculations there that make some endorsements more valuable and more interesting than others.
Ryan, do you have a question for Chris?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, and obviously we're still waiting on the petitions to be filed and potentially challenged and everything. But, given the at least somewhat clearer picture we have now of everything since the last time we had you on here, are there any races in particular that you see as being, really hotly contested? Or on the flip side, is there anything that you see as kind of being like a formality at this point and locked up for the most part?
I'm never going to say that anything's locked up or a formality, because the downside of being wrong is so much huger than the upside of being right. I would say that there has been a question in my mind about the mayor's race, how competitive Ed Gainey was going to be able to be, because he got such a late start. One thing he has done very successfully is he raised a boatload of money. I mean, he raised over $130,000 in about a month and change. Which is good. I mean, he's going to need more of that, but that is a lot of money. And a lot of it came from people who gave fairly small dollar amounts, which means they can give again if they want to. The city does have caps on how much money you can give to a candidate. And he's got a lot of upside there. Even if he didn't get a single new donor, he can go back to a huge chunk of those folks and get more support from them. So, I think that'll be interesting. Getting the committee endorsement was important for Mr. Gainey, if it was kind of a foregone conclusion. So, I think that race will be interesting. We haven't talked about it much, and we probably want to retain some of your audience, so we shouldn't talk about it too deeply. But I think there's huge stakes at the state level. Aerion was talking a little bit about some of the ballot questions that will be facing state voters. You could argue that the ones involving emergency powers for the governor is a life or death issue. I mean, those are ballot questions that Republicans have basically put on the ballot because they want to limit the governor's ability to do things like declare states of emergency for the coronavirus. And when you really think about kind of how that's played out in Pennsylvania versus other states, that's a crucial issue. And I think too, there is a seat on the Supreme Court up for grabs. Justice Saylor, who's been the Chief Justice, is stepping down. We have seen last year how significant judicial elections can be down the road, even if you're not paying much attention to them at the time. And I will say that the most likely Republican that you'll be seeing on the ballot in November is Commonwealth Court Judge Brobson, who is one of the very few judges in the country who gave Republicans a positive ruling during their myriad of election challenges last fall. So that kind of stuff I think is important. It's tough to cover those races because they can be a little sleepy. But if I didn't have the ability to stay awake beyond the capacity of most mortals, I wouldn't go to Democratic committee gatherings, or I wouldn't come out of them, I guess, more to the point. So I think a lot of that stuff is important. Again, kind of a sleeper at this point, but don't go to sleep on it.
Absolutely. And I think another interesting, point with, and it was one of your tweets, that broke it, at least for me, when, you mentioned how much money that the Gainey campaign was able to raise. And I think another thing that it does, it potentially makes people hedge, it makes eyebrows raise up, and, and people that might be on the fence, or people that want to support him, but also want to play it safe and say, I really want to support you, Ed, but if Peduto wins, I want to have a good relationship with the mayor for the next 4 years. So unless, you put up some points, and obviously one of the ways to put up points, to use a sports metaphor, even though I know many, many people hate when we use sports metaphors in politics, but it's just so easy sometimes, but he's moving the needle, and I think that's what you have to do, when you're a challenger. So I think it's something that is going to be interesting. And going back to the committee thing, I know one of the things that I heard was, in the process of deciding who folks were going to support at the city level in the committee race, there was a thought that there would be a shift of folks who are committee members who would have voted for Peduto. Peduto would have gotten in, so kind of looking at that 40% of not necessarily all Moreno voters, but in a secret ballot that represented, if it was a three-way race, it probably would have been 60% Gainey, Peduto X amount of percent, and then the rest of that 40% would be Moreno.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, because I think a lot of people have looked at that 40% and they said, oh my God, 40% of the committee voted for this Trump supporting Jagoff. What the hell is the matter with these folks? And I get that response, but you raised one issue, which is, I anecdotally can tell you there were some pro Peduto people who figured, I'm going to get behind Moreno because any vote against Ed Gainey sort of weakens the strength that he draws from this win. He's going to win anyway, but a 60-40 win doesn't look as impressive as an 80-20 win, right? So the other thing too is, and I say this in all humility, we reporters sometimes make the mistake of thinking everybody reads our damn stories, and they don't. So I wrote about some of this. City Paper actually was the first to write about Moreno's Twitter account. And for that matter, the Twitter account, it wasn't like it was hidden or anything like that. It was like lying out there in plain sight for months. So people just didn't pay that much attention to it necessarily. They didn't see the City Paper article. They didn't see WTA's follow-up. They didn't see my story about his party registration swapping and things like that. Maybe they should have. You could argue that, committee people are supposed to be really informed voters, and that's why we care what they think about the candidates if we do. But they don't always, right? And the other factor too that I think is sort of worth considering is Tony Moreno got into this race in the early fall of 2019, and he didn't waste time. He was out there talking to people, and I had committee people tell me that, like, I have been hearing from this guy for a long time. So even the ones who heard this story, they feel like, oh, Tony, he didn't mean that, or that's just kind of how he is, or whatever. I'm sure that, I wouldn't be surprised if some of those stories, maybe he would have done a percentage point or two better. I don't know. It's hard to say, really. I find it very hard to believe that there were circumstances in which he could have won that endorsement. Right. But hey, I've been surprised before. by the committee's choices. So, I can't be sure, but I just think it's sort of like, and I'm not trying to make excuses for anybody's vote or anything like that. I just think it's really difficult to gauge what was going on there. I will say this too, is like Moreno for a first-time candidate. The last time I was on here, I was like, these candidates got to show me something. I don't know if this Moreno guy's for real. I don't know if this Will Parker's for real. I mean, I've now seen Tony Moreno speaking in front of Democrats. And he's a lot better than a lot of first-time candidates, just as somebody who watches how people perform and stuff like that. And that's not to say I agree with his policies or that anybody else should. I'm just saying that he is not. I mean, I've seen disastrous first-time candidates run for jobs like this. I mean, there was a mayoral candidate who once advertised himself with a nude photograph in city paper with the words, "I will kick your ass philosophically." There was another candidate. There's another candidate who ran as a Republican on a platform of fiscal restraint, who'd gone through bankruptcy and was like sleeping on his mom's couch when he was running. Like, so there, this Tony Moreno is not one of those guys. He is not like that. He has definitely tweeted stuff that many people understandably find objectionable or whatever. But he is a candidate who has taken this seriously, and he's done his homework. Whatever else you want to say about his police, and I think that's a factor that needs to be thought of too, as we kind of try to sort out what happened with this outcome.
Absolutely. And go ahead, Ryan. I'm sorry, Miracle.
Miracle, do you want to say something?
No, I was going to say, like, I know that when we had our pop-ups last year, he made it his, a concerted effort to show up and talk to people. And there are people I've known who've called him out on his issues, and he's been, very responsive and making apologies and kind of excuses. And so he is, really campaigning. But given where we are in policing and having this conversation, and again, like we were referencing earlier, he really hasn't put out a lot of policies about what a more reformed Pittsburgh police would look like. Again, there's been lawsuits, there's been police violence, police shootings. I mean, he hasn't even done like the community policing approach model, right? But I do think that there are a lot of conservative Democrats that I still like to say Pennsylvania. People still get mad about that. But I do think that we kind of forget that Pittsburgh is not like this liberal, progressive, multicultural bubble that we sometimes think it is. And so there are a lot of people that see his campaign and just resonate with his message just because they're not there yet in that progressive space. So I don't think we can write that off. But I'm also very curious because we did see like a few thousand people exit the Republican Party after the January 6th riot. So do you think that's going to influence the election at all? Because they're technically not Republicans anymore. So do you think we're going to see more of a conservative shift from the Democratic Party?
It's an interesting question, is what the lasting effect of that shift will be. I think Donald Trump accelerated a trend which was already sort of underway, at least on the statewide level, which is that, a lot of Democrats, a lot of those more conservative Democrats, and, we're mostly talking about white Democrats here, right? A lot of those folks had been voting Republican anyway, and had increasingly been sort of trending and flipping their party status. That picked up during the Trump years. It kind of paused for a little bit after. I think it's really hard to like march down after what you saw on your TV on January 6th and be like, sign me up for more of that, please. But that doesn't mean that in a month or two they won't sort of come back out and start doing it. I think on the flip side, though, what we have seen, especially around Philadelphia, is a lot of suburban Republicans who are comfortable voting for a Pat Toomey or whatever, as a fiscal conservative who believed in, to hell with unions and, we shouldn't even have a minimum wage and that kind of stuff. Now sort of rethinking whether they can support somebody like that without supporting that whole rest of the party. I think it'll be interesting. You mentioned earlier that Jeff Bartos jumping into this race. I've talked to Bartos at some length when he ran for lieutenant governor. I would expect him to be the kind of candidate that some of those folks your Montgomery County Republicans or Chester, some of those places, some of the voters in those places who just switched parties could see themselves voting for in November 2022. So a lot sort of depends on who gets put up, how lasting a trend that is. Similarly, the Democrats have their own kind of decisions to make here. We've got John Fetterman here who's trying to sort of appeal both to the sort of wayward Trump voting Democrat while also sort of holding down his progressive bona fides. We'll see how much luck he has with that. I'm old enough to remember Fetterman appearing before the Pittsburgh chapter of Democrats of Socialists of America, and he got completely shellacked. People just hated him there. And one of the reasons they hated him there was because he supported Paul Costa over Summer Lee. It's not a foregone conclusion. John Fetterman gets more positive media coverage per ounce than any candidate I think I've ever seen in my entire life. But that doesn't necessarily count for a lot. I'll also say too, Miracle, just because you mentioned the thing about police accountability. One thing I've noticed about Moreno in particular, he will talk about police accountability, but if you listen carefully, he's mostly talking about problems with the supervisors. He mostly talks about sort of problems with accountability by command level staff. And if you listen to that, what you kind of realize is he's a retired cop, so he was a rank and file police officer, and all those guys hate the boss just the same as the people who work for me hate their boss, right? I mean, so it might sound like he's, like he's sort of for reform, and there may be some ways in which he is, but his idea of reform, his focus tends to be on we need accountability from the people at the top, which of course we do, but that's not necessarily the same as accountability for the officers out in the street who were the ones deploying the tear gas during last year's protests, right? During last summer's protests or whatever. They're not necessarily the ones who are arresting people of color at higher rates or any other kind of stuff. So he's like I said, he's good. He's a good candidate in that he's really very skilled at kind of framing his issue that way. But kind of listen for that and see if you notice that yourself as well, because it's something I've picked up on. For a retired police officer to be talking about that, he kind of has to walk an interesting line there.
Absolutely. Ron, do you have a question?
Yeah, so I guess I'll just follow up on that last point you made about Tony Moreno, honestly. So just, given what we've talked about him, being a good candidate in certain ways as far as how he's run his campaign thus far, and even if most of his votes from the Democratic Committee were just Peduto people who wanted to vote against Gainey, he was still able to pull a substantial portion of those votes. So do you see Tony Moreno as being somebody who could, even if he doesn't really garner much as far as votes in the primary in this election, be somebody who sticks around and is a name that we see in future elections?
Yeah.
From, or
that's a really interesting question. I don't know, and it's probably too early to say. I will say I had a conversation with Mr. Moreno earlier today, and he said, one of these other two guys has got to get out of the race because they're just spoilers. So he's convinced that they're spoiling his chance to be, everybody's sort of accusing everybody else of dividing the vote that they themselves would be entitled to. So, his representation, for whatever it's worth, is that, I became very concerned about sort of the direction of the Democratic Party, although he always calls it the Democrat Party, which is a tell sometimes. And so I decided, and I did these tweets, and I thought the tweets were stupid. That's no way I was just trying to, be bombastic and get people's goat. But now I'm going to sort of take up the mantle of leadership and actually try to do something. So if you take him at his word, he may be around again. But again, I've seen a lot of candidates kind of pop up, and they're kind of one and done candidates. They take a run at this, and then they go away. I really don't know what his plans are beyond this. I doubt he'd tell me at this point because he's, going to be the next mayor of Pittsburgh.
And I know we only have a few minutes left, but one thing I've been thinking about, Chris, recently is just the dynamics of the race. And if, Moreno is able to stay in, just assuming that he has reached the signature threshold, and everything is in order, tomorrow for his campaign, raises an interesting question of, does he help I've been thinking, like, does he help Ed Gainey more? Does he, neutralize, if it's a one-on, obviously conventional wisdom is you want a one-on-one,
Right.
when you're taking on an incumbent. But in a situation like Ed Gainey, where there's votes in Carrick's, there's votes in Hayes, there's votes in Lincoln Place, that in a one-on-one, they really don't like Peduto, but they'll probably vote for Peduto. But if you have a Moreno in the race, maybe those votes go for Moreno, and now you, like, parts of the upper north side and parts of the South Hills are now taken off the table, and it becomes more space between the East End, the Hill District, the lower parts of the north side, and the more of the South Shore, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, you can spend a lot of time trying to think of those bank shots or whatever. I don't have the math, to be honest with you. Right. I'm an English major, so it's hard for me to kind of work that out. Intuitively, it's hard for me to imagine somebody that there's I shouldn't say there's nobody, but it's hard for me to imagine there's a statistically significant number of voters in a place like 19th Ward, right, which is kind of your largely white working class South Hills communities like Beachview, like Overbrook, like Brookline. That there's a large number of people who are like, oh, I would have been for Ed Gainey to stick it to Bill Peduto, but now I'm for this Tony Moreno guy. Maybe, but I just think there's a sort of cultural thing that goes on there, that these are folks who aren't looking to solve the Bill Peduto equation by going to Bill Peduto's left. Right. So my guess is a lot of those folks, just absent a Tony Moreno, might not bother. Right. I just don't know the answer to that question at this point. I could tell you, as we have at WESA, we've extended invitations to all three of these gentlemen to participate in a mayoral debate in mid-April. If another candidate makes it onto the ballot, we'll do the same there. And if one of them doesn't make it onto the ballot, we'll rescind our invitation and tell them to stay home that night. But our intention at this point is that we're likely to see Tony Moreno on the stage. And I think that's, I think what's maybe more interesting is you and I like to think about what all the political implications could be. I think for the voters, it's more important, like, what do they bring to the table? When they talk about changing how policing is done in Pittsburgh, what do those visions kind of look like? What's the way to go forward? And the extent to which he throws sharper relief on what a Bill Peduto or an Ed Gainey is proposing, I think it could be useful. I have had debates where that sort of third candidate who's not really serious just sort of ends up sucking up a lot of time and oxygen that you feel like would be better spent on the candidates who actually have a chance. I think Mr. Moreno has done enough homework that he's not going to be a distraction in that way. Right. That he will sort of help flesh out that debate, even if he brings stuff to the table that a lot of people, don't want to have anything to do with. So in that sense, I think it'll be interesting to see the role that he plays there in terms of how he shapes that debate. What happens on May 18th? I don't know. I'm not that smart. I can't tell you.
Absolutely. And we'll go to Miracle, but before we do, like, that is a very interesting point, and it brings to mind the 2005 mayoral campaign when Hop Kendricks got in.
Yeah.
And, in debate after debate, everyone knew Hop was going to win, but he just sucked up so much of the air that Michael Lamb and Bill Peduto could never land anything on Bob O'Connor.
Yes.
So could have that impact. He just became, the star of the show, much like, in previous presidential campaigns when Al Sharpton, would be at the debate. It was just so good on his feet, such a great, rhetorical presence, that they just suck up all this air, but then ultimately, they're going to finish fourth. But Miracle, do you have a final question for the night?
Do we have any debates scheduled that we know of? Has that schedule come out? Not that anyone was going to be sucking out the air, not saying that, but it's because just to go along with the last question.
Yeah, I think I don't know that there's I don't know what's been scheduled quite yet. I know that there are, actually I take that back. There have been one or two occasions where they've been sort of in the same venue together. Last week, all three of the candidates appeared before the 14th Ward Democratic Committee. I think there's a neighborhood forum in Brookline coming up sometime this week. We will be having our debate, I hope, second or third week in April. I can't remember. There'll be some others, I'm sure. So yeah, we intended, and in fact, I will say that when we sent out our invitation, the Gainey campaign responded within an hour or two, confirming their interest and willingness to attend. So hopefully, within the next day or so, look for an announcement from us, because we do hope to have confirmation from those candidates by tomorrow about their interest level. I'll say too, by the way, Kahari, I never saw Bob O'Connor smile more in 2005 than when Hop Kendrick started to answer a question, because you could just see him watching the clock wind down. He was like, I didn't have to answer anything. That's 2 more minutes that I don't have to answer. I mean, I say that out of no disrespect to Hop Kendrick, because I do think he had, he obviously a guy with just an incredible legacy in Allegheny County and in the Democratic Party and everything else. But in the function of that race, that was a complicated 4-way kind of contest there. And it speaks to your point about just sort of dividing up the opposition, and how that can at least let an incumbent skate in a different kind of way. Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Chris Potter.
Thank you.
ESA joining us once again. Looking forward to talking to you before this election is all said and done. Again, Chris Potter from WESA FM. And that concludes our show for this evening. But actually, it doesn't conclude that, because I always forget about the announcements that we have to make. So we're going to go back to Miracle and give us the rundown of what to expect this week before we close out the show.
Yeah, we have a really cool week this week. Tomorrow at 2:00 for Tuesdays at 2 p.m. We are talking about what does it mean to be a Black artist in this region in Pittsburgh. And so we have a lot of great artists like D.S. Kinsel and Jessica Mosk coming on to just talk about the realities of just being an artist and trying to survive in this era of COVID-19. A few weeks ago, we had a guest on that was talking about the situation in Tigray and the war in Ethiopia. And so tomorrow, at midnight, it starts the 24 hours for Tigray. It's the international streaming moment that just talk about education and actions that you can take. I will be starting the U.S. North American Canadian hour for the 24 hours for Tigray tomorrow at 4 p.m. So if you actually follow 24 hours for Tigray on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, you can get the links for that information. On Wednesday, we're going to have our favorite This Week in White Supremacy show talking about, we're talking about the Queen, y'all. We're going to be talking about Harry and Meghan and all of the foolishness that's been happening, as well as people trying to ban the hate you give in the local high schools, the middle schools, because they think it's inappropriate. So we're talking about a lot of local issues. Thursday, we have on Tilt, Thursday at noon, it's going to be Mama Brown's 50th birthday. So it's going to be a very special episode this week for On Tilt. And then we have coming up Blacklight, where we're going to be talking to various local artists about their art and how they contribute to this space here in the region. So we have a lot of really cool events coming up. So we look forward to you joining us. As a reminder, please make sure you're registered to vote. You can register to vote if you haven't already by texting reg to vote to 77948. And if you look in the chat, we do have a link now that helps you build up your ballot for the election. So after this week, just come back and keep checking, because there are going to be a lot of referendums this year on the ballot, what Aerion was talking about. So everyone has something to vote for this year. And with that, I will turn it back over to Kahari.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the last thing I did want to say, just to go away from politics and back to popular culture. I know it's been something that folks have been talking a lot about, but if you have the opportunity, you have Disney Plus, definitely check out WandaVision. It's a very, very interesting experiment in television. I don't usually give a shout out. I really didn't even big up the Mandalorian. Everybody knows I'm one of the biggest Star Wars fans out there. But yeah, like I watched WandaVision with my 9-year-old over the weekend, and I thought it was just extremely incredible experiment in television. So I don't know if y'all have checked it out yet, but I thought it was really cool.
Because that's the Mandalorian in Star Wars, right?
Yeah, the Man.
The Mandalorian Star Wars. Yeah, I don't know what just happened with Kahari.
I don't know what happened, but the reason I was asking is, for those of you who don't know, Kahari also hosts a show on Sundays. I want to say maybe 11 a.m. Not 100% sure, where they just talk about like Star Wars. So outside of politics, we do a lot of different things we have like going on as well. And of course, Ryan is the producer, makes beats, made our theme song for the show. So a lot of cool things that we have. So with that, Ryan, do you have any last words?
I guess since you brought it up, I'll be announcing, 2 new songs I have coming out with some people soon tomorrow. So for anybody who follows me on socials, you'll see that. Other than that, let's see. Oh, happy International Women's Day. And I think that's pretty much all I got. Yeah. So I think we're good.
Yes. Love, protect, respect Black women, love Woman Today, Cash App, some women, support them. And with that, I hope you all have a great rest of your evening. Thank y'all so much. Have a good one.
Thanks, y'all.